Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues. It's a real pleasure to have everyone on the call. I think there's a few people just coming in now, one or two additional participants. So let's just give it maybe 1 minute and then we'll kick off. But it's lovely to welcome everybody to the webinar.
Thank you so much. In Zambia, it's good afternoon.
Good. Wonderful. Good afternoon.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. I am Mudumulla from Ethiopia.
Good morning. Good afternoon. Okay, colleagues, we have a lot to get through. Other colleagues, I'm sure, will be joining us as we go through. But first and foremost, welcome to this webinar on the urban finance gap, practical pathways for local government finance across the Commonwealth. My name is Lucy Slack. I'm the Secretary General of the Commonwealth Local Government Forum, convening this seminar today. And I just want to start off with a couple of very small kind of housekeeping points, which I think everybody is probably aware of now, but it's always good to just remind colleagues. The first is to say that we're recording the meeting, and we're planning to make the recordings available to people who haven't been able to join this event in person after the webinar. We've secured some time in the program for questions and answers and comments from the floor. So please do feed in any questions that you might have or any comments that you might want to make into the chat, or raise your hand and we'll take questions from the floor. We really want this to be a webinar that answers some of your questions, that addresses some of your issues, but also hears some of your challenges and the things that you're working on, some of the innovations that you're taking forward. So we want it to be very much a kind of two-way process. We've got a 90-minute program that's planned. So we've got our kind of main speaker, and then we have some respondents, and then we'll be opening it up to the floor. But before we do any of that, it's my absolute honor and pleasure to invite the chair of the Commonwealth Local Government Forum and the mayor of Belize City, Mayor Bernard Wagner, to give some opening remarks and reflections. Mayor Wagner, over to you.
Thank you, Lucy. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, colleagues, whether you're joining us from across our Commonwealth. As chairperson of the Commonwealth Local Government Forum and Mayor of Belize City, I am honored to welcome you to a conversation that really goes to the heart of whether local government can really deliver on the promises we make to our people, right? Every mayor knows the distance between a good plan and a completed project, right? That distance to many of you is often measured, I believe, in finance, and that is what we'll be speaking about today. Our residents as mayors experience government locally, right? When the street outside their home floods, when waste is collected efficiently, or when a neighborhood is safe and alive with economic opportunity, these are not a line item on a national budget to them. They are the everyday measure of whether really government is working. And quite rightly, they expect local leaders to really act. But expectation, again, alone cannot pave a street, modernize a drainage network, or prepare a coastal city for a changing climate. Vision must be matched by real authority. Vision must be matched by resources and responsibility. And so this is where we continue to plead for decentralization of decision-making to really and truly empower local authorities. I want to quickly share a live example from Belize City We are a prominent seaside community of ours. The southern foreshore area has been experiencing that coastal erosion as climate change impact begin to adversely affect our coast. So the response of the Belize City Council was to look at how we could get immediate technical help. And so we collaborated through a matchmaking exercise in Panama. And I could remember how we originated that plan in a room, just like similar to what we are having today. And we had our international partners, Blue 21. We conducted this climate adaptation intervention by way of floating pavilion along the same area that is being compromised. And so our study was heralded as really feasible. It was a strong projection for cost benefit performance and was well positioned for climate and development finance. You said everything was good, but again, we required some sort of intervention from the national government. And you know that in some cases are a very slow process. And so we were advised they would take it on, but again, it would take about 18 to 24 months. And you could imagine how this delay could have the adverse impact in derailing our entire effort. So all because, again, of decentralized, a plight many of you all share. So in Belize City, we continue to work to strengthen our streets and our drainage infrastructure. We want to improve public spaces. We want to support enterprises while making our communities more resilient. One well-chosen investment, I'm certain you can speak to it, how we can protect homes, support businesses, create jobs, and restore confidence in our neighborhoods. As mayors, we also see the opposite though. When funding is short-term, when funding is unpredictable or difficult to access, many cities are really pushed into managing urgent needs instead of shaping that long-term development. In fact, emergencies can't always be budgeted for. In our city, we are currently again facing an invasion of sargassum, like other coastal municipalities in the Atlantic. The crisis exists, folks. The crisis exists. Tackling it is urgent, of course, but the finance to address it. We need greater autonomy to engage in urban financing. My friends, ladies and gentlemen, that is a real urban finance gap, in my view. It is not only a shortage of money, it is a gap between mandate and means. It is a gap between local knowledge and decision-making power. And it is a gap between the urgency really felt in our communities and the pace at which finances really reaches those communities. So this discussion demands more than another call for local government to do more with less. It requires a serious partnership among local and national governments, financial institutions, and of course, development partners. One that treats cities as capable partners in investment, not merely as final point of delivery. The Commonwealth gives us a valuable advantage, the ability to learn across different contexts while recognizing the challenges we share. Through CLGF and Commonwealth Sustainable Cities Network, we can turn that experience into a really stronger collaborative and collective voice that really shapes practical reform. So today I really want to encourage all of us to be candid about what is not working, be ambitious about what can change, and be disciplined about turning these findings into really action. The value of this paper will really be measured by not how often it is cited, right? But by whether it helps communities gain the infrastructure, the services, and the resilience they deserve. So I thank the Urban Finance Action Group, Astrid Haas, our Commonwealth Sustainable Cities Initiative partners, many of our respondents, and everyone joining us today for contributing to this really important work. I'm now pleased to really hand over back to Lucy Slack, our Secretary General of CLGF, to really frame today's session and the wider work. Thank you. I'll hand it back to you, Lucy.
Mayor Wagner, thank you so much for that. And for everyone who's subsequently joined since we did the first welcome, hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. And I think, as you say, Mayor Wagner, you know, decentralization is really such a critical kind of element of this debate. And the question of local finance really does sit at the heart of whether decentralization can deliver meaningful results. And I think local governments, we know, are often very close to the needs of people, but they often don't control the decisions that determine that fiscal space and their borrowing options, or indeed their access to climate finance and development finance. And this is one of the threads that we'll hear, I hope, from Astrid when she speaks to the paper. But more importantly, this kind of conundrum was really the central reason why CLGF has been supporting this work of the Urban Finance Action Group. We want to move the discussion away from a conversation that treats the finance gap as being about individual municipal capacity to something more structured around mandates, around revenue, transfers, borrowing risks, and the institutions that connect national resources to local delivery. So we really want to look at it as that kind of ecosystem of finance. And so our purpose today is really threefold. The first is to introduce the paper and its main findings, and colleagues will have received the paper already and will have links to it. The second, I think, is to hear how some of the evidence that the paper has delivered really resonates with practitioners, but also with experts in the municipal finance field. And the third is to show a little bit about how analysis has been translated into some recommendations that the Urban Finance Group feel, you know, really respond to the breadth and the diversity of the Commonwealth with materials that members and partners can use. And I think, you know, the strength of the Commonwealth, as Mayor Wagner said, is very much around our ability to mine the Commonwealth for good examples, case studies, good practice. But equally, we don't expect every model to be able to work in every single Commonwealth country. And the value, I think, of the Commonwealth and of this paper particularly is identifying some of those kind of common system level questions, but recognizing at the same time that that kind of reform also has to be adapted to national and to local contexts and realities. And I think that's something that, you know, the Commonwealth actually plays quite an important role in convening us to do. What we really would like the paper to do is to improve the conversation among actors and partners that come from different starting points. And already on this call, we have colleagues who come from a whole range of different perspectives. We know that local government focuses very much on delivery, finance ministers very much on issues around fiscal risk, regulators on some of those prudential standards, and development banks, of course, on generating projects which are bankable and making sure that the appropriate safeguards are in place to protect their funding. So reform has to look at all of those concerns and to bring them all into one coherent system. And that's really where we're trying to use this paper to move us towards. And as I've mentioned already, the recommendations are already on CLGF's website. We'll share the link at the end. And after the session today, this today is in the sense it's the opening session. It's setting a little bit our stall out to colleagues, and we're going to follow up with this with a series of more detailed thematic webinars. So I hope you'll see this as being the first in a series of events. And our aim, therefore, is not just about visibility for the research, although obviously we're really keen to make sure that this research is in the public domain and that but mostly that it can be of practical use to our members and our partners. It might be something that could help, for example, a local government association frame its dialogue with central government. It might be something that could support a local government looking at different systems and looking at how it might want to strengthen its own systems. It could be something that might look particularly at sort of the needs of smaller municipalities and cities. And also just generally, we hope it will help the Commonwealth more broadly in carrying a much clearer message of the needs and the priorities of local government into those wider policy-making spaces. Please, I encourage you to be active participants, to think about your questions and your comments as we go along, and to be an active sort of part of the discussion. But also tell us also about things that maybe don't resonate with you. Tell us if there are recommendations that you think we have forgotten or we need to put more emphasis on. As you can see on the slide, we've got one kind of key sort of presentation, and Astrid Haas is going to be doing that for us. She is the author of the paper, and she's developed the paper in close collaboration with something called the Urban Finance Group. And we'll come into the Urban Finance Group a little bit in the presentations. And then we have 2 or 3 respondents who we're going to call on immediately after Astrid's presentation. Mer Wagner, who you've already heard from briefly, but also Richard Okuku, who's the Secretary General of the Uganda Local Government Association. So very much dealing with these things on a day-to-day basis. And then also David Jackson, who is the non-resident fellow at New York University Center for International Cooperation, who's an expert with significant experience in municipal finance over a number of years. So before we come on to those 3 respondents, I want to introduce Astrid Haas. Thank her for a fantastic paper. And please, Astrid, over to you to sort of share the key findings with our colleagues.
Thank you so much, Lucy. Thank you to you, Claire, Janine, the rest of the CLGF, but also thanks very much to the Urban Finance Action Group, who really have shaped not only the thinking behind this paper, but have really shaped and pushed my thinking when it comes to urban finance. So I really appreciate that. As you can imagine, it's with a diverse region like the Commonwealth, it's a bit of a Herculean task to try and cover everything. And so this paper doesn't aim to be comprehensive in that sense, but it aims to leverage the diversity of the Commonwealth to be able to understand what are the key themes that are emerging when we think about this urban finance gap. I'm not sure, I can't see my slides yet. I don't know if they are up yet, but I'll keep going there we go. So yes, the full paper is very rich. I will only sort of touch upon a few key themes today, and then I very much look forward to the discussion afterwards, particularly to the respondents, many of whom I've actually drawn on for this paper as well, but all of whom I respect enormously, and who are the users or potential users of some of this research and information. Next slide, please. So, the framing of the challenge, the reframing of the challenge, I should say, and Lucy went into this in her initial comments. We often, when we work as urban finance practitioners, we often work at the sort of local government level, and we think of this sort of gap as a capacity gap. But the urban finance gap is really sort of the difference between revenues and expenditures. But the difference between revenues and expenditures is not just a capacity problem. It's not just about how much revenue we can collect or how we spend it. It is, if you click again, Janine, it is very much a multi-level governance and a systems challenge. Lucy touched upon that, but this was the premise that we went from for this research as part of the Urban Finance Action Group, that it's not just something that you can sort of tinker with at the local level and fix, but actually that you need a much more comprehensive national fiscal system, regulatory frameworks, development finance institutions, and financial market capacities to work from together. To investigate sort of this premise, next slide, please, as I said, we looked, the Commonwealth is very, very diverse. We picked 18 countries, and we picked 18 countries because they represented different versions of the urban finance gap challenge, or potential ways that the urban finance gap challenge was being addressed. We examined these 18 countries across 6 dimensions, the 6 dimensions you see on the screen. The 6 dimensions were developed again in close collaboration with the Urban Finance Action Group because they are interdependent, right? A weakness in any one tends to compound weaknesses in the other. But a strength in one is not going to help just, magically ensure the urban finance gaps disappears. Rather, you need to have strengthening all the adjacent dimensions to really address this challenge. So we looked at 18 countries and 6 dimensions. The 18 countries are highlighted on this map. And you will be able to see in the paper itself very, very detailed analysis of different countries and where they sit along these dimensions. But I will just, next slide please, highlight 5 recurring themes and why they matter and how they can help enhance finance for cities. So again, this was a very, I'm very grateful to have been able to do this exercise because it allowed me to examine municipal finance systems all the way from Canada to Kiribati, which, are often will probably be seen as very, very diverse systems, but there were reoccurring themes that stood out. So the first theme, next slide, please, is that again, we often focus when we talk about local government finance or urban finance on how we can strengthen own source revenue. Yes, this is critical because this is the revenue that is in control of cities themselves, both to raise and to spend. But if you look across the Commonwealth, it is actually a very small part of most revenue bases. And in fact, particularly for the most rapidly urbanizing countries of the Commonwealth, where actually intermediary cities are growing faster than capital cities, own source revenue is often negligible. And so, yes, we do want to strengthen own source revenue, but actually what we came across is that it's really the financing mix, and in particular, how you strengthen intergovernmental fiscal transfers and ensure that this is, which is the majority of the revenue for particularly smaller and fiscally weaker municipalities, is particularly key, right? So if you just strengthen own source revenues, the absolute value still remains too small to address the urban finance gap. So the sort of, if you click again, the sort of conclusion we come from sort of this is that alignment should happen across the whole financing mix, right? It's not necessarily that we sort of only focus on one rather than not the other, but we particularly as well when we work with national governments have to look at how we strengthen the predictability, the value, and the timing of intergovernmental fiscal transfers. Just a very quick example of a Commonwealth country that we looked at sort of, which is on the sort of higher end of the predictability of transfers, is we looked at Canada, which has a very strong, very well embedded institutionalized intergovernmental fiscal transfer framework. But again, none of this is perfect, right? And if there are any Canadians on the call, they will also probably call out that they are very frustrated with their intergovernmental fiscal transfer system because whilst it is very embedded, whilst it is very formula-based, the framework has not been adjusted in recent times to reflect underlying changes in economic conditions such as population aging and energy transition, which all have significant strains on municipal budgets, right? So, but it is on the sort of one end of the predictability. The next theme, next slide, please, is around that. We talk a lot about needing to access cities to access financial capital markets, which is very true in terms of the needs of finance will exceed any individual city's municipal budget, often multiple times, right? And where prudently managed borrowing is not a sign of weakness, but it is a strategic instrument. That being said, it is not just having that authority on paper. So, for example, in this dimension, we looked at Kenya, which in its 2010 constitution actually formally permits counties to borrow. But to date, no county has ever managed to borrow. Laikipia County came close, but just as it was about to go to market, they had a political change in the governor and that was stalled. So the conclusion we came from this theme and looking at the experiences in this, if you could click again, Janine, is that legal provisions are necessary, but absolutely insufficient to support subnational borrowing, which also is very dependent on aspects like creditworthiness, regulatory design, and very, very importantly, the political willingness at a national level to be able to do this. At the same time, and here Mayor Bernard Wagner can speak to this when he speaks to his own experiences in Belize City, the supply of finance is key. And in a lot of cities that require local currency financing that are on the sort of lower end of the economic growth or development spectrum, they don't necessarily have sufficient access to local market financing. This is something that Belize City managed to overcome in very interesting ways. Next slide, please. The third theme is we talk about the need for capital for projects, but capital availability is often not the binding constraint. In fact, the graph on your left shows that private capital going to infrastructure has exploded over the last decade, and is seeking out particularly infrastructure investments. It's just not necessarily going to where it needs, right? And part of this is a project pipeline problem, which I think many of you on the call will be very familiar with, and this is data from the African Development Bank on the side, of those projects proposed. And actually not very many projects are proposed, because even getting a project from an idea and a concept to a proposal already filters out a lot of projects. But those that are proposed, only 20% or so, according to the African Development Bank, get past feasibility stage, and only less than 10% of those get to financial close. So we do have a project pipeline problem. But the other thing is that capital availability for cities is also very tied to macroeconomic structures. And here, for example, we looked at the case of Pakistan, which is pretty much there is no local government borrowing can happen in Pakistan, not only because the provisions don't necessarily exist on paper, but because Pakistan over the last couple of years has undergone various IMF programs. And given subnational borrowing conditions are very closely tied to sovereign risk dynamics and macroeconomic adjustment problems, it doesn't only just affect the national government, but this even is not only trickles down, but actually expands the challenge for then subnational governments who are deemed to be more risky to be able to access finance overall. So if you click again, the sort of theme, the conclusion of this sort of theme is, the finance architecture is not merely the money, right? The money in some ways, shape or form is there, but it constitutes the audited accounts, credible revenue projections, procurement readiness, project pipelines, and generally whole of life planning. Next slide, please. The fourth theme, and again, this is not going to be new to many people, but climate risk does not automatically unlock climate finance, right? This is a graph that many of you will have seen from the Climate Policy Initiative that shows, the majority goes into mitigation finance, and it doesn't go to necessarily those places that actually need climate finance or are being affected by the climate crisis the most. But in particular, is very, very little flowing into adaptation projects. Here, as I said, I had the real honor to look into Kiribati. I'd never looked into sort of Pacific Island states, but Pacific Island states, including Kiribati, and another one that we looked at, Fiji. Right. They are really at the forefront of the climate crisis. I mean, we went to the Pacific Urban Forum with some of these results, and these islands are talking about disappearing because of the climate crisis, but they have very high difficulties of accessing climate finance and being able to adapt. And in particular, in the case of Kiribati, most of what flows in climate finance doesn't even flow through the national government system, let alone any sort of local government. It just flows through sort of international partners and development projects. So the conclusion for this theme, if you click again, is that unlocking climate finance for local adaptation depends not on what your climate risk is. Unfortunately, I wish it did, but it's absolutely not the case. But what's your workable national intermediary routes through accredited institutions? And here we have a very interesting case of Malta that has is not particularly climate vulnerable in the grand scheme of things, if you look at it, for example, compared to Kiribati or to Fiji, but actually does do pretty well in accessing climate finance because it uses embedded EU mechanisms, European Union mechanisms, to be able to attract those climate finance flows, right? So it's really about what are the entities and institutions that you have to be able to access this. The next theme and the final theme that I'll talk about today is that the urban finance gap is also an equity gap. This is particularly for those rapidly urbanizing countries where actually the smaller cities are the ones that are growing faster, where being able to invest in advance of settlement would be up to 5 to 7 times cheaper, but they are the least able to access the finance that they need. And in part, again, we talk about this often as a capacity gap, but in part, this is also embedded into a lot of national systems where metropolitan concentration is like a powerful driver of fiscal disparity. Here we had the most extreme case that we looked at was the Gambia, for example, where the Greater Banjul area pretty much crowds out investment in any other place or any other local government in the Gambia. And so horizontal equity, so that's equity across different sizes of cities, depends on institutional design. And here we looked at Australia as one of the most comprehensive institutionalized equalization frameworks, in part because they have independent state grants commissions that are responsible for distribution of local government grants. And they do this on equity-based principles so that all local governments are able to deliver a certain level of services. And so the critical lesson from Australia is not just that you need strong equalization institutions, but also that those institutions themselves are independent, formula-driven, and subject to periodical methodological revision. So unlike the Canada case, which hasn't been revised in a long period of time, in Australia it's revised on a 5-year basis. So the conclusion to this theme, if you click again, is that the interaction between urbanization patterns and the fiscal architecture, particularly in rapidly urbanizing countries, means that you sometimes entrench a very strong bias towards capital or primary cities at the expense of smaller cities, but that you really need to look at this as a whole systemic structure in terms of the equalization tools that are needed to be able to rebalance the urban system. Next slide, please. In addition to the survey, we also looked at some very in-depth case studies. And again, all these case studies, they are 5 of them. They are also on the CSCI website. But just to pick out just a couple of themes from there. Next slide, please. I won't talk about Belize City because we have the absolute expert on here, Mayor Bernard Wagner, who I've learned so much from. But Belize is just a very exciting case because for all of those places that say they haven't, cities that haven't been able to go to market, Belize is like a mid-sized city in a relatively small country that has floated a municipal bond. So I think that's a very, very cool case from to show how it can work, but also creatively and innovatively. We also looked at, for example, Kerala State and how they've actually built their own sort of urban policy from the ground up and using democratic principles, but embedded urban finance within that. And Kigali and Rwanda in general, who are currently in the process of operationalizing land value capture instruments, but not by copy-pasting, but rather by operationalizing based on their own local context. So, these city case studies show you that the Commonwealth's diversity offers rich cases, but really very strongly, I can only emphasize these should not be taken as best practice models. None of the way Belize floated its bond is not going to work in Uganda because it's a very different system. But the takeaway is that you need to really take the principles of what you need to reform and then really make it fit for purpose for your own context. And finally, we looked at, as the next slide, please, financial intermediaries, as I mentioned, particularly with the climate finance, but with all these flows, right? It requires various institutions to intermediate between national systems, regional systems, and the international system. The international global finance system is not set out to finance cities. It's a very Westphalian state-based structure. We're not going to change that overnight. So how can we help create these institutions? We looked at various institutions. They're all on the slide. The takeaway is all of these institutions are very, 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 very different in their structure. Some are local council owned, some are national government owned, but all they do, but what they commonly have is that they aggregate demand, reduce risk, and produce local currency financing, prepare projects, and help financial discipline, right? So they help get finance to cities. But it's also, most of this finance is debt finance, so it only suits certain cities with viable projects and prudent fiscal frameworks, right? You still can't get past that. So just to conclude, this is sort of just a rapid overview, and I really do encourage you to take a look at the larger paper and the case studies. But this, to go back to the first, where we started, the main finding from this is the urban finance gap is it's not a local capacity gap. And in fact, we can't just work on local capacities. It's the shared responsibility between national governments, cities, regulators, intermediaries, and all other partners who are working on this to help align the financing mix, build the core systems. We can't get past the core systems. You can't go to innovative side if you don't have the core systems in place. And particularly for the smaller cities in our urban system to help aggregate and intermediate demand. All of that to really protect equity and to be able to finance the future of cities that we need, not only for the cities that we have now, but for the future cities that are there to grow and to be able to produce intergenerational equity. So let me stop there. That was a bit of a whirlwind tour through very in-depth research, but actually I think the more important part of this conversation is that I can now hand over to Mayor Bernard, Richard, and David, who are sort of experts in actually implementing this, and I would love to hear their reflections. So Mayor Bernard, please, over to you.
Thanks, Astrid. I'm going to stop you just to do one more thing before we invite you in to give your reflections. Sorry, it's my fault entirely, Astrid. I'm just looping around slightly. I just want to bring in Janine just to say a little bit about the Urban Finance Action Group, just so that everybody on the call is on the same page, because we've mentioned it a few times, and I think it would be nice to do that first before we come to you, Mayor Wagner. Literally a couple of minutes. Janine, over to you.
Thanks, Lucy. And I will just take a couple minutes just to kind of explain how the work that Astrid just went through, how it was developed, and what the Urban Finance Action Group process actually produced, and also a bit about what you as our participants, as our registered participants, have said in your registration about what you wanted to explore today, right? So the starting point for this whole work was a challenge that was shared across the Commonwealth. Local governments are expected to deliver the essential services and the infrastructure, but their ability to finance that delivery is shaped by very different fiscal, very different institutional, and very different market conditions. We therefore needed a process that would combine comparative evidence with the practical experience of our members. And the Urban Finance Action Group was established under the Commonwealth Sustainable Cities Coalition, or the CSCC. I know you will see a few acronyms around, but that sits within the wider Commonwealth Sustainable Cities Initiative, or the CSCI. And CLGF led the urban finance strand of work. The group brought together local government leaders, Mayor Wagner is here, local government associations, finance institutions, and also urban finance practitioners from different Commonwealth regions. And CLGF is using the Commonwealth Sustainable Cities Network to share the outputs with you, our members, to connect the research that has been done through this paper to local government experience, and also to support wider peer learning and any policy discussions. So as Astrid has already mentioned, the research examined evidence from 18 different countries across 6 different dimensions of urban finance. The action group members, they then tested that evidence against their own experience. Their discussion is what was used to sharpen the findings, to identify where national and local contexts have any differences, and also to refine the recommendations so that they were able to speak more directly to implementation. The action group therefore had a role not just to endorse this completed paper, but the members were reviewing the emerging analysis. They challenged the assumptions that came forward. They contributed some of the examples from their own systems, and they also helped to identify the issues that matter most for local governments and also for their local government associations. So this was an iterative process, and it was able to therefore strengthen both the diagnosis part of things and the practical emphasis of the final work that was produced. The process therefore produced this final paper that Astrid just went over very briefly. It produced 5 recommendations, which you will hear soon. It produced case studies, and it also produced supporting resources, which are intended for practical use in your policy dialogues, anytime you are doing advocacy and in the work that you do as our members for implementation. So these, as Lucy already mentioned, the materials are already available on the CLGF Urban Finance webpage, and today's webinar brings the next phase of that engagement with members and with you, our partners. The outputs really are intended to work as a connected package so that the paper provides the evidence and the comparative analysis. The recommendations identify the priorities for reform, and the case studies, as well as the supporting resources, they help the members and our partners to consider how those priorities they might be applied in those different contexts. Just to say, in your registration, we asked you what you most wanted to explore in this webinar, and we received quite a lot of feedback, about 159 different types of responses from participants across at least 35 countries. And the next slide shows that the largest area of interest represented about 32% of you who were interested in local government finance systems. And then climate infrastructure finance accounts for about 21%, and a further 21% focuses on practical examples and local application. So that's why we have the respondents here with us today. We have Astrid here with us today. The paper's main findings also accounted for 18% of your feedback, and while the remaining responses focused on the revised recommendations, intermediary pathways, and capacity building, we're aiming throughout this process in this webinar to touch on those. The balance here is really important as well, because what you are saying as participants is that you want to understand the evidence, but you are equally interested in how the finance systems work and where the practical pathways exist and how the materials could be used in your own context. So those priorities are what have guided Astrid's presentation today. And thank you so much, Astrid, for what you've gone through so far. And it will also guide the discussion that will follow. So thank you again so far to everyone. I do encourage you, share your any questions or comments in the chat. Very valid. Back over to you, Lucy.
Thanks so much for that, Janine. And I think that sets us up very nicely to come quickly to our respondents. And then for colleagues on the call, please start thinking about your questions and any comments and recommendations and points that you'd like to raise. So maybe without further ado, Mayor Wagner, I know you opened by sort of setting out a little bit of information about the sort of local government context and the sort of political nature of the work. But as a mayor and someone responsible for implementation and delivery, where do you think that cities and local governments can close that finance gap most directly? And what sort of really resonated with you from the paper as a local government leader?
Thank you again, Lucy, and thank you, Astrid, for a very clear and important presentation. What I took away off the top is this quote that you did there, which speaks to borrowing is not a sign of weakness, but a strategic instrument of sustainable urban development. That stuck with me, Astrid, in your presentation. From my own mayoral perspective, one of the strongest message along with that emerging from your paper is that the urban finance gap is not simply the result of weaknesses within individual local authorities, but rather it is a systems challenge from what I gathered. Mayors and councils all across the Commonwealth may be held many times accountable for the conditions of their streets, their drainage, their public spaces, sanitation, and other essential services. However, the revenue authority, the borrowing arrangements, and really access to long-term financing needed to really address these responsibilities are often determined beyond the level. It is always at the national level. So in your paper, you spoke that this misalignment between responsibility and the practical control is where the challenge becomes visible for municipalities, such as mines. Many times our residents do not separate local and national fiscal arrangements. When a street floods or when a drain fails or an essential project is delayed, they understandably look to their local leaders for solutions. That is the case in many of our Commonwealth countries and cities. The mayor and council must therefore answer for delivery every time, even when many of the financial instruments needed to deliver are outside their direct control. This is specifically for cities such as Belize City. We are a low-lying coastal city facing increasing climate-related risks while also managing the daily demands of urban growth and aging infrastructure. I'll give you an example of a practical example in the pumping station. This is an IDB funded project which was completed in 2023. It was funded again through the IDB, an $11 million project, and the Ministry of Infrastructure, national government arm, really was the catalyst behind that project. We can see that the project really worked well. It has proved that substantially effective in draining the city waterways during flooding, so it worked well. The finance was accessible, but the problem is the maintenance of that $11 million asset, which is expensive but mandatory, right? Maintenance is expensive but mandatory. That part of the project was not financed, and so that placed an additional load on an already strained council resources. This is why financing infrastructure across a full life of the asset is so important in my view, and construction is only the beginning. For a mayor, a project succeeds not simply when it is completed, but when it continues to work for the community. That is how I view a successful project. The paper also correctly identifies a difficulty local governments face in accessing climate and adaptation financing. The cities most exposed to climate risks may have some small technical teams, may have the least capacity to navigate complex application processes, that is all across the Commonwealth. In small cities, they do not have the capacity to prepare investment-ready projects or meet the requirements of the international IFIs. So we must be careful, therefore, that access to finance does not become available only to the cities that already possess the greatest resources and institutional capacity. Within the constraints of limited decentralization, the Belize City municipality tries to be as creative as possible in finding practical solutions going forward. And I speak, just last week, we were able to sign a letter of intent with ICLE, Local Governments for Sustainability out of Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean, which will really look at how do we explore the possibility of ensuring our urban infrastructure. And also 2 months ago, we engaged with the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, UNDESA, for technical assistance to strengthen our infrastructure asset management. As a municipality, we also have to look at how we strengthen our revenue collection, our financial management. We need credible data, we need transparency, we need accountability, so as to really close the finance gap. National governments must provide predictable fiscal transfers, as you rightfully stated. They must provide a workable borrowing frameworks and appropriate local revenue authority, right? Again, I boast about Belize City. The central government recognizes Belize City transparent and healthy fiscal administration. And so they supported the Municipal Securities Act of 2024, which really enabled us to engage local investors, institutional investors, to float municipal bonds and turn those short-term municipal paper that we had on our books to more long-term bonds, which will align with the lifeline of the asset that we funded. And so that again is a benefit for us as a city and those that we serve in our municipality. Development partners must likewise provide project preparation support and mechanisms that reduce risks, particularly for smaller municipalities and climate vulnerable states. Many cities may know their needs, but still require specialized help to produce finance-ready projects. For me and my city again, the practical value of this paper is that it asks not only why can local governments not do more, but what must change across the system so they can deliver effectively, equitably, and sustainably. So again, Lucy, my message to fellow mayors as we speak today is that we must strengthen our institutions while speaking collectively about the reforms we cannot achieve alone. My message to the national, local governments, and development partners, the IFIs, is equally clear. Local governments are not merely beneficiaries of development finance, but rather essential partners in designing solutions and delivering results. If we want infrastructure and services to reach people where they live, then finance must reach the level of government closest to them, and that is local government. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mayor Wagner. And I think that's a really nice segue into our next speaker, Richard Okuku, from the Uganda Local Government Association. And I think that point that you made around the sort of the collective voice of local government is a very important one. And Richard, I'd just like to come to you and just ask you, how you feel the paper sort of responds to some of the sort of priorities that you have as a representative from local government association, and also where you see the kind of principal opportunities or constraints for practical uptake across the network in your own context. Richard, please, over to you.
Thank you, Lucy, and thank you for the questions that you raised. What does it feel like for us? Is it relevant to the local governments and the local government association? That's a very critical question. And I want to start with the relevancy. What we are discussing today and the work that the Urban Finance Action Group has done is a tremendous job that has been done. And I want to mention that the case studies that have been shared and that Astrid talked about in her presentation, what has been missing. Because, for example, when you look at the case study of Belize, how they were able to manage to overcome the infrastructure backlog that the national government could not even address, of course, due to the sovereign debt constraint issues that many African countries are faced with, that many Commonwealth countries are faced with. So, and we see that, a local authority, the city comes up and then manages to overcome the infrastructure backlog. And how do they do it? They establish an autonomous revenue base, of course, through the bond issuance. In Uganda, we have been trying to come up with the subnational pooled financing trust, and we had issues on who manages the trust, where does the trust sit. But we see that in Belize, through their partnership with the Ministry of Finance, and then they also introduced the central bank. So they engaged the central bank, brought the central bank on board, of course, for purposes of ownership, for purposes of trust, because the central bank image is critical, and then the investors would feel confident to invest. So, that alone for us is relevant, because we were stuck at one point, and we are saying yes, whereas this may not be what Astrid, and the team agrees that are not best practices, but they are case studies. So for me, for us as the local government and local government association, these are practical cases, practical experiences that we draw from, and then we are able to engage with our governments, we are able to engage with our members, the local governments, to be able to navigate the significant legislative gaps that do not allow cities. And this entire process has also brought across something very important to mention, that across the African continent and in very many of the Commonwealth countries, ministries of finance, they treat local government borrowing as a financial risk to be managed rather than an instrument to be enabled. So considering the partnerships that we see happening in countries like Belize and the Belize city, this gives us an opportunity from which to learn and say, how do we manage this in our local context? How do we interest the central bank? How do we interest the ministries of finance to change their perspective, to change the way they look at our local governments? So the availability of the documented case studies on innovative financing models, it's an opportunity that we take and we can leverage on, learn, pick a few good cases that we can augment into our papers to inform our discussions with the different stakeholders at various levels of government. So, and this process for us, the Urban Finance Action Group, has exposed us to a team of experts, people that have done a lot of work in regarding to local government financing, climate financing, and they come along with wide experiences that has been put into a paper, that can be shared. So for the local governments out there, it's important to pick onto these, learn from where we are. For example, where we have constraints in Uganda and many African countries on inadequate financing for decentralized services. So the case studies have demonstrated to us how we can overcome some of these. And this has even triggered our planning internally for us as the Uganda Local Government Association. This has triggered our planning and shift, because initially we have been doing some studies on local government financing where we look at what's the share of the national budget, but we stop at that. So this time around we are moving a step higher, and we are saying, can we now do a study that looks at the mandates without money? So what does it cost? Literally looking at the cost of financing local government responsibilities, in our country. So let's look at the cost of financing local government responsibilities. And then another study, of course, this one will now look at the local government mandate financing gap, where we shall develop an index showing the percentage of legally assigned responsibilities that remain unfunded. And then the second study that we are launching will look at the local government financing dividend. We are looking at what gains do we get as a country from investing in a decentralized services. So we have another study, about 3 studies that we want to do, but simply arising out of the experience we have gotten from the Urban Forum, the Urban Finance Action Group, from the case studies we have seen here. We are saying, let's change the way we are working. Let's look at local governments as enablers. Let's not look at them as risk institutions. So where we've had aspects of own source revenue generation as constraints at local governments and local economic development, we have some lessons. Can we activate our pooled financing trust? The access to climate change financing. And now in 2022 in Uganda, the initiative called LOCAL, or the Local Climate Adaptive Living, was started. And it started with 4 local governments. So this year in 2026, it has now expanded to 24 local governments. So you can imagine, out of 176, we are covering about 24. So this kind of approach is what we need to advance our advocacy, to elevate our advocacy to higher levels, to see to it that many more local governments can benefit from initiatives like this, for them to be able to access climate financing. Because we realize in the case study that it's not just about how climate change impacts you as a country, as a local government, but it's about the systems, it's about the intermediaries that support you access the kind of financing. Here we are supported by the UNCDF, and then as a country, the Ministry of Finance established the climate change, the climate finance unit to try to support build the capacities of local governments to access climate financing. So,
Richard, in the interest of time, can I just ask you to kind of wind up so that we can get into some questions from colleagues on the call who have their hands up, please?
Sure. So as I wind up, and this is for the wider uptake, what do we need to do? I urge that these case studies should form critical narratives for the advocacy for local government financing with our different governments across the Commonwealth countries. And we should have these case studies documented in papers that are presented at international fora for us to be able to influence financing for local governments. And then the last one is let's promote exchange learning, or what we call peer-to-peer learning between local governments across the Commonwealth, for us to be able to learn from what is happening in other countries and how other cities have been able to overcome the financing challenges. I want to thank you. That's it from me. Over to you, Lucy.
Thank you so much, Richard. And I think you kind of framed that really, really spot on. And it's great that there's been the work that you're doing has been coinciding with this piece of work under the Urban Finance Action Group, and we can see where they immediately come together, which is really positive. We've got one more respondent, David Jackson. I'm going to hand over, David, quickly to you. And then if colleagues have questions or points or things that they'd like to raise, please put your hands up or put them in the chat. David, please, over to you for some reflections from your perspective.
Thank you very much indeed. And I'll try and be very direct and get straight to the point, because I know that a lot of people would like to intervene. First, Astrid, this was an amazing piece of work, and all the other colleagues that worked on it, thank you so much. I think we have really moved the needle in when we talk about this urban finance and local government finance. And I'd like to explain why I think this report changes the debate a little bit. Firstly, why were we stuck? If you look at the political economy of it, banks like to lend, so they're always looking for bankable projects. But that's a bank problem, not a local government problem. They're the ones who want the projects to lend to. That's what they want. The development finance industry is set up around governments. So they like World Bank, African Development Bank, you name it. They like to lend to governments, or they like to finance governments or fund governments. So that's all at the central government level, the development finance. The Green Climate Fund works with central governments only. And then finally, the ministries of finance, they don't see yet, but as Richard Okuku mentioned, they don't see the dividend in investing in local governments. So for ministries of finance, money going to the local level is often seen as a kind of money thrown away. Better to keep it where the capacity is, as they see it, at central level. So I think this report kind of takes those issues head on and tries to move the debate. So as Astrid pointed out quite clearly, people often say, well, local governments just improve their own source revenue and there's not enough public finance, so we need bankable projects. No, local own source revenue, as Astrid mentioned, is a very small amount of local government revenue. It's an important amount. But as we're finding, if you invest in intergovernmental fiscal transfers, could you put, by the way, slide 20, the recommendation slide up? If you invest in intergovernmental fiscal transfers, you actually see a dividend. And I think what's very important to note is that, economies are growing. Yes, public finance is constrained, but broadly speaking, there is more public finance now than there was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So all economies are slowly growing. So it's not true that there's less and less and less. It's about how you distribute it. So that's part one of the systems change. Invest in local finance systems. I think the second element I wanted to talk about, including intergovernmental fiscal transfers, make that a key part of national development. Funds the local government should be a part of national development because there's a dividend in it. The second point going forwards, I think, is this issue about intermediary pathways to finance. So we've heard from Belize about the bond. There's also a really interesting bond in Tanzania. There are other intermediary institutions that we looked at, FACOM in the study, etc. So we really need to strengthen those and change the culture a little bit. Many countries have capital markets, but they're usually used to finance things like the telephone companies, the mobile phone companies, import, export. They're not really used for long-term infrastructure finance in local currency. But as we're seeing, that can actually be done. And it's a far better way to invest pension funds because your pension in local currency is being invested in your future. So it's a far better way to recycle domestic savings. And we have not yet seen that. And there's no reason why not. These capital markets are quite big now compared with 20 years ago. Even in a country like Tanzania, where we were able to do the Tanga bond, there's room for more in the capital market if we can get the policymakers to address the issue. So I think stronger intermediary pathways to finance, also using these subnational development banks, is a critical point forwards. Now, when it comes to local access to climate and adaptation finance, this is also something where we can move the needle. I think the report starts to do that because, as Richard Okuku mentioned, in Uganda, there's LOCAL, the Local Climate Adaptive Living Facility. There are similar mechanisms elsewhere. And what these are able to do is to reduce risk at the local level through local climate adaptation investments and therefore seek finance from global finance like the Green Climate Fund. And in a number of countries, the Green Climate Fund has financed through ministries of finance, local governments that are implementing programs like LOCAL. And the justification is the following. If you want to reduce your climate risk, you do that at a local level, and that actually builds fiscal space and it builds local economic development. It'll never be bankable. It's always about drainage, water management, improving local infrastructure. We shouldn't try to claim that can be bankable. 70% of climate adaptation is water management, but it reduces risk, and without it, there's no economy. Because if you can't get your goods to market, there is economy. So it's actually a dividend to invest in local roads, and you're reducing your risk. So I think that is an element that we're starting to get people to understand. Finally, the fourth recommendation, finance infrastructure for the full life of the asset. So Mayor Bernard Wagner spoke about this in the case of Belize. Now, in fact, another 70% of the cost of local infrastructure is in the use and disposal phase. It's in the maintenance phase. And we need now to see a greater focus, both from ministries of finance and local governments, in the asset management portfolio and in the asset management phase. If you invest in that, you can actually achieve significant savings in fiscal space. So these are slightly new areas: asset management, local risk reduction through intergovernmental fiscal transfers and local investments, various forms of borrowing as a strategic option, not as a weakness, as a strategic option, local capital markets if possible, because then you don't increase the national debt. One of the reasons why ministries of finance will be reluctant is because the World Bank is already maxed out. They don't want to increase the national debt. In the Belize example, in the Tanzania example, we were able to do this through local currency that doesn't increase the national debt. And so let's move away from the argument bankable projects and more own source revenue, please, because that's the political economy of the banks, the development finance institutions, and the ministries of finance. If we move to this new system that we're talking about here, we can actually really move forwards. So I think those are the main points I wanted to say in terms of the pathways for action and the institutional constraints that must be addressed. And I think the beauty of this report is it's both theoretical and practical. So it's not just talk, it's also how to do it, but you do need to understand the theory in order to be able to do it. And I think the report does both. So a real privilege to be able to work on this. Congratulations to everybody. And I hope we have time now for some discussion and conversation. And I really look forward to taking this work forwards. Thank you very much, Lucy, and everybody else.
Thank you, David. I just want to say a huge thank you to Astrid for giving us such a kind of clear and concise kind of review of what has been an absolutely huge piece of work for which we're incredibly grateful. A huge thank you to the members of the Urban Finance Action Group, including Richard and David. It's great to have you on this call. And most importantly, to all of the people who we know have read it and will read it in the future, because as you say, David, it's very much designed to combine theory, but also very much highlight the practice and the practice within the Commonwealth. I've got a couple of people with their hands raised. I'm going to come first to Aboria Orji, who's had their hand up for a little while. Please, Obiora, over to you. You might need to just take yourself off mute. Okay, maybe we'll come back to you, Obiora, sorry, and maybe you can see if you can take yourself off mute. Our next questioner, so Sandra Singh. Sandra, over to you.
Thank you,
maybe
Lucy.
say who you are a little bit before you start.
Thank you. My name is Sandra Singh. I'm the regional manager of CLGF assigned to the Caribbean. My question is to Mr. Jackson. I heard you make reference to domestic savings, and I wondered whether, as part of the mobilization of finance strategy, any consideration or has there been any experience at the local level with the finance and project approach of deploying the build, operate, and transfer principle in partnership with the private sector? Thank you.
Thanks, Sandra. I'm going to take one more. We also have a question from Given Kamanga from Chembe. Given, over to you, please. Maybe just say who you are and where you're from.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm Given Kamanga from Chembe district. I work under local government. I'm the director of planning for Chembe district in Zambia. These presentations are very interesting, and I appreciate for the invitation. My concern is on to the conveners. How do we make these nice presentations, these lessons, so to say, have influence to the policymakers in government? Looking at for this meeting, those who have been invited are just a small group. What plans do we have so that these discussions can influence policies, and also which will eventually have these fiscal transfers get to the grassroots, and so that we are able to see an improvement in service provision, infrastructure, implementation of climate resilience activities. What is the plan? What are we looking at so that we can these discussions can have influence on policies for each country? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Given. I'm going to come maybe first. I don't see any more hands just now, but if anyone wants to come in with another question or a reflection or a comment, please do. I'm going to come maybe first to you, David, and then Astrid, I'll come to you as well.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the question. So build, operate, and transfer is often done through project finance. So this is where you basically create a special purpose vehicle, which is basically a company that builds something, operates that thing, and then eventually that thing is transferred back or belongs to the government or the local government. So like I think of an airport or a port, The company is created, it builds the port, it operates the port, but the port at the end of the day belongs to the state. So it is transferred back to the state at some point. Now, when you come to domestic savings, that's exactly, I think, what Belize was talking about and what we managed to do in Tanzania and other places are now looking at. You can borrow by using domestic savings on local capital markets in order to get a build, operate, and transfer thing going. So that's where the connection comes. If it's the right project, if it's the right and most appropriate use of funds, then domestic savings could be used in theory for a build, operate, and transfer model. And this is starting to happen. In Tanzania, the Tanga water bond, it wasn't exactly a build, operate, transfer, but it could have been if there'd been a build phase. But that was able to finance water, clean water, to thousands of people who didn't get it before through improving a water management system and a dam that's operated by a publicly owned company, but that operates in the private sector arena and is financed through a domestic currency bond. So it's local savings, it's Tanzanian investors that are investing in this company that's operating the water. It wasn't exactly a build, operate, and transfer because there's no building to be done, but it was kind of, it is actually an operating and eventual transfer. But yes, using domestic currency for that is a far preferable, if possible, than borrowing internationally. Because when we go back to the political economy issues, that's where the ministries of finance get reluctant, and that's where the World Bank and others also are not always the keenest to do it, because they like to lend to governments or because the country itself is maxed out on its borrowing. But thank you very much for the question.
Thank you. Astrid, let me bring you in next, and then we've got a couple more questions, and we've got some interesting comments and reflections in the chat. Astrid, please.
Yes, I'm just going to quickly respond, and also to one of the reflections in the chat as well. So thank you very much, Sandra, for your question. I just want to, so, you know, David has done an excellent job of the sort of explaining the build, operate, and transfer. I just want to re-emphasize something that David said in his intervention previously, which I think is something that I hear far too little, and I try and preach a lot when I work with city governments, is that not every project is bankable. Not every project should be project finance. A lot of these things are public infrastructures and services. By definition, they have a higher social value than they will have a return. And in fact, by the time that we try and do everything, like, you know, more and more cities are trying to say, well, the private sector will bring in the money and we'll do everything through project finance. It comes at a cost, at a very high cost. The private sector is there to make profit, right? And so I just wanted to, I mean, I know that wasn't your question, but I think it raised in both hearing, you know, David's intervention, just emphasize that you really have to select the projects well that are amenable to that. But also, as city governments, don't forget there's public infrastructure that is just not going to make a return because you need your city to function. But as David said, can open up your local fiscal space. So it may not be like a direct return, but has a bigger piece. So I just wanted to reemphasize that, David, because I really like that point. Joshua, a very good friend and colleague, also put some really interesting reflections in the chat. And I think, you know, I around this question of own source revenue, right? I did de-emphasize it in the presentation and the takeaway. It is re-emphasized a little bit more in the paper itself. And you're right, Joshua, like own source revenue, strengthening own source revenue is absolutely key. This is a lot of work that I do with cities directly. Not just because of the absolute value, what I was talking about, because it also demonstrates the city's readiness as a partner. It demonstrates good public financial management of resources, stewardship of resources. It creates confidence in national government's Ministry of Finance and development partners. So absolutely, I absolutely think that is true. But I think the reason we de-emphasized it a little bit in this presentation is that I think just kind of like the project finance piece that the private sector is going to finance everything, it feels like the own source revenue piece is also taken over, right? Like so long as we raise own source revenue, then all cities will be fine. But actually, when you look at the numbers, there's some cities doing a fantastic job. They've raised own source revenues by over 100% in a couple of years. But in absolute terms, it's not enough, right? And so it's just about how you think about where we position the conversation. So it's not to say it's not important. It's absolutely critically important. getting the basics right. It's just about how we really need to not only get the basics right, but not expecting that to be the be all and end all of the urban finance gap. So thanks for that. Lucy, back to you.
Thank you, Astrid. And I know that you did also raise a question around, you know, how are we going to turn this kind of policy into, how are we trying to get this under the noses and into the agendas of policymakers. My colleague Claire's going to say a little bit about that when we get to the end of the webinar. So rather than duplicate, I'm going to just park that element of your question given until we get to the end of the session. We've got two more hands here, which I'm going to come to next. So Mr. Wudu Moulinet, please, over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Lucy. And I also appreciate Astrid for your awesome presentation. I am from Ethiopia. I have two questions. One, is this study applicable to Eastern African cities, for example, in Addis Ababa? The other is, what do you recommend for future research in the context of Eastern Africa? Thank you.
So hold that thought, colleagues, and then I'm going to come to our next hand, which is Kamungaru Faisal. Please, over to you. You might need to take yourself off mute, I think.
Thank you very much. This is Faisal from Uganda and Kasese in particular. Are you hearing me?
We hear you perfectly. Please go ahead.
Yeah, this is Faisal from Kasese municipality. And of course, that's part of Western Uganda. I want to appreciate the sessions that have been taken us through, but have some few observations that, especially when we talk about the municipal borrowing authorities in terms of financing. Especially when I compare to what Jackson was showing up, making a comparison from Kenya, from Tanzania and more other African countries, I find it very strange that in some most African countries, when look at the rate of inflation, the rate of inflation in most cases usually affect this kind of investments. Even when you think that you can borrow, you can have internal borrowings. But at the time when you're having the project outcomes already, the inflation has killed everything. And of course, like he observed that most of local governments tend to withdraw out of that kind of system. I think that as we carry out these researches, let's look at also what are the tenable inflation rates within these countries and what's their impact. Because most of the cases, like if you compare the projects which have been made and given the current oil crisis in the country, realize that we can't achieve what we thought we had borrowed for. That's one. Then two, of course, some African countries, there are those with clear, they have clear fiscal policies that are usually giving our foreign entities or giving our partners and all these a very good climate for investing in. But a state without a clear fiscal policy makes people fear. We have seen projects that have been erected, but because of the change in the fiscal policies, it leaves people hanging and the cost of investment becomes too high. So I would be proposing that in future, when we court more other searches, let's look at the country's fiscal policy against international standards. You realize that today, in Uganda, we are now taking on. In Uganda these days, we have now gone for internal borrowings, borrowing from the banks, borrowing from the big investments. But the safety around it is that there could be the clear policies in Uganda that support that. How about these other countries that are within Africa and Scandinavian countries? How can they benefit out of this? If you don't have clear policies that are rhyming up international standards and are a bit enforceable, then it becomes a bit tricky for local governments' financing system to exist and to become more sustainable. Thank you. That is my contribution.
Thank you very much for that, Faisal. Really, really helpful. I'm going to leave those two with our speakers. We've got a couple of really good questions as well in the chat, which I also want to just kind of draw everybody's attention to. The first is from Alston Alain from the Ministry of Local Government and Regional Development in Guyana. Can someone comment briefly on how corruption in the local government system may undermine the financing of urban infrastructure? And then a second question, which is from the Association of Local Governments of Nigeria. This was Obiora Orji. Do you want to come in and ask that question yourself? Only I can see your hand's just gone back up. Please go ahead. Maybe not. It's definitely around how local government associations access municipal bonds and climate change finance requirements. So I think we've touched on some of those things already, but I think it would be useful just to reflect on that. And then there's one other, there's some other comments in the chat which people may be interested about in terms of other resources that colleagues might want to look at, including from the OECD. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go now to all of our speakers. I'm going to come sort of a bit in, I'm going to start with you, Astrid, please to come in on any of those particular questions. And maybe when you round out your comments, just what is the single thing that you'd really like to leave with everybody as the kind of, you know, the author of the paper, someone who's followed the process and just reflecting on the questions that we've got from the webinar today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for those great questions. First of all, very great to see such a large Ugandan contingent on the call. Just to say, me too, I'm Ugandan, and I have just arrived back in Kampala for good. So I look forward to interacting with many of you on many of these questions in our own country as well. So that's really great. I want to start backwards on the inflation rate question that Faisal put and countries' fiscal policies. Absolutely, right? I think that's part of what we looked at I mentioned in the case study of Pakistan. What a subnational government, what a city can do is really constrained as well by the macroeconomic environment. The reason we don't usually address it in an urban finance question, because it's very unfortunate, but there's very little cities can do about that, right? That's a question for a central bank or a Ministry of Finance. And unfortunately, cities are not often invited to the table for those discussions. But I do think where we should push more is for cities to have more conversations with central banks and Ministry of Finance. I think we highlighted the case of Belize, where their municipal bond only happened because they had these very, very, very close conversations with the Ministry of Finance, with the central bank, knowing that they had to be partners and had to be on board. So I think we should push for cities to open up those conversation channels a lot more. On the question of corruption in urban finance, excellent question. It is a really big, big problem. The way I see it and the way when I work with city governments on this is that, you want to raise your taxes, you want to raise your own source revenues, you want to raise your fees. You have to also show citizens what they're getting for it. And if that, what we call the social contract, if that's broken, right? If you are just saying to citizens, pay taxes, pay taxes, pay taxes, but they're not seeing anything, their potholes are getting bigger, the money is disappearing, they see politicians with big Rolls Royces, right? They're not going to want to pay their taxes, and fair enough, right? It's very hard earned money. And so the way I look, and when I work with city governments, when I work on questions of own source revenue, I don't just look at the revenue side. Most city governments just want to, when they come and ask me, they just want to raise money. They don't want to think about spending money. But you need to think about the spending money, which is super critical to be able to raise the money. And that's where the corruption piece comes in. So I think that was a great question. Wudu, finally, to your question. Yes, this is absolutely, there's a lot of examples from East Africa in here. Ethiopia isn't one of them because Ethiopia isn't part of the Commonwealth. But where is this applicable and where should future research go to? Well, it's exactly what you're doing, Wudu. So just a shout out to Wudu, who's really done a great paper recently on land value capture in Ethiopia. It's about how we take these principles, or as David mentioned it, this theory, right, that exists. We know land value capture, for example, is great in theory, but it only works in practice when you can actually operationalize it and understand it in your own context. It doesn't, like, there's no point in doing best practice theory, because Ethiopia's land governance is very different to Uganda's land governance, very different to Kenya's land governance. So I think a lot of future research should be about how you take these principles and how you actually understand them in your own context. And it may not look like what we call it as a best practice, but it's the practice that works. And this is, for example, what Rwanda is currently doing with operationalization of its land value capture instruments. So that would be my one takeaway, right? Is not to take these as like given, this is what we should do. It's more like, great, it can be done. And I think we have demonstrated through this paper, it's been done in super diverse contexts, right? Then you can take the question and is, how can it be done in my own context? Let me leave it there.
Great, thank you, Astrid. I'm going to come to Richard. I'm going to come to you next, and David, and then Mayor Wagner, if you want to just give us a final reflection as well. But I'm going to ask you, please, if you can be as concise as possible, because we are pushing now against the clock a little bit. So, Richard, over to you.
Thank you, Lucy. And I think there was a question raised on the tenable inflation rates versus the borrowing, and then also the unclear fiscal policy. I think that's an issue that we discuss at the national level, and it can be shaped on how the different research studies that we do internally. So for me, I think I want to end this minute with this. We need to leverage on the existing case studies documented under this approach, and the work that the CLGF has been able to do to be able to influence decisions at the highest levels. For us, as the Uganda Local Governments Association, we have taken advantage of the Commonwealth Local Government Partnership and support from these studies, because we have a project we are working on that looks at reshaping local government financing in Uganda. And this information is used to re-strategize, to realign the way we are thinking, re-strategize and realign the research studies we are conducting. And that's why I mentioned the studies that we are going to conduct, because initially we had planned to implement some studies, but we have revised them considering what we see coming out of these studies. So I want to encourage all the participants on this call to take advantage of the case studies. Do not pick everything as is, because this is not a one-size-fits-all. Pick out what can best fit within your local context, and then you should be able to influence decisions at the highest level. I thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, Richard. David, I'm going to come next to you.
Thank you so much, Lucy. So just really quickly on corruption. Yes, it's a big issue, but let's not assume that local governments are automatically more corrupt than central governments. In fact, sometimes there's more constraints on a local government. People have more eyes on them, and perhaps the corruption can be just as bad elsewhere. So, and on inflation, this is even more the case to use domestic currency where possible, because inflation devalues the currency and makes it more difficult to borrow in hard currency. So that is a factor, but I think it's very important to have good fiscal policies. But on the main takeaways, Lucy and everybody, I think there's perhaps two really main takeaways. It really is not one size fits all. It's about looking at the system in your country, taking into account everything that we've talked about, and seeing what works, and then taking that conversation to your national policymakers, to your ministries of finance. One of the questions was, how can we access climate finance? Have this conversation. Say, look, we can actually reduce climate risk for the country by working in the villages, because this is where the climate risk is taking place. So we can, like in the case of Uganda, put the money down there to reduce that climate risk. So it's not one size fits all, but I think we have the material in this report to start that dialogue. I think that's the first takeaway. And the second takeaway is, let's be aware that of the reasons why the system is not as we would like it to be, and use that knowledge to get the system that we really want. So I think it's understanding the principles and the theories behind it, and then using that to drive the practice that will really take us forwards. I mean, as we're all saying, it's not all bankable projects. Next time you hear somebody saying we just need more bankable projects, you have the evidence to say, well, no, actually, Even in the richest country in the world, climate resilience is not done through bankable projects alone. It's actually done through investing in public infrastructure. And that's an investment, not an expense. It's not a waste of money. It's an investment. So I think now we have these kind of arguments on that and others like the asset management, like the domestic capital markets, like the strategic borrowing. So it's about being more sophisticated, having all the tools, and understanding it's not one size fits all and there's not just one solution. But so thanks everybody. I think we're really moving forward with this paper and this Urban Finance Action Group. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And our colleague Given earlier on asked the question about, how do we get this to policymakers? What are we going to do next? And I'm going to bring in Claire Frost, Head of Programs here at CLGF, to just say a few words about that before we close up the session. Claire, over to you.
Thanks so much, Lucy. So it really is a pleasure to have this role in our webinar and to be able to share with you kind of how we work to take this paper into, a key set of recommendations that we can use, that multiple actors can use kind of across the various kind of sectors that are working on local government finance. We've consolidated these recommendations into a set of 5. You'll see that there's the overarching recommendation, which kind of frames the other more specific recommendations. So giving local governments the fiscal space to deliver with an explicit equity lens across the urban finance system. I think this is really kind of like the frame that we want to give all of the recommendations and our work going forward within the urban finance group. Then more specifically, we have the recommendation on strengthening the local government system to make investment possible. We want to look at building stronger intermediate pathways to finance, creating workable local access to climate and specifically adaptation finance. And we want to really look at how we can finance infrastructure for the full life of the asset. So these are all issues that you've heard already kind of come out in the discussion over the course of the day. So of course, that overarching recommendation really means looking at how are we matching responsibilities with the realistic combination of local revenues. So ensuring that there are predictable transfers, workable borrowing arrangements, which will ensure that reforms benefit the smaller, the weaker, and the underserved municipalities, so that we really have an equitable system across countries. Then, just recognizing that there is a local authority is not enough. Local governments need to have the financial management, the reporting, the revenue administration, the procurement processes, the project preparation systems that are necessary to be able to raise finance. So building that capacity at local government level is so key. The third recommendation is really looking at the issue that local governments are not able to reach these finances directly. So development banks, municipal funds, pooling mechanisms, other intermediary ways to aggregate that demand, reduce risk, and provide long-term local currency finance are essential so that we can create differentiated pathways for municipalities to reach the financing that is appropriate for their level of readiness. Then, of course, our fourth recommendation is around climate. So how are we, ensuring that much needed climate finance is reaching the local level? There need to be practical national pathways and intermediary channels that ensure that climate and adaptation resources are reaching place-specific priorities, and that project preparation is in place as well as these appropriate fiduciary systems. The final recommendation is around widening financing, kind of more financing our wider finance horizon. So thinking about not just mobilizing funds for a specific piece of infrastructure, but how are we going to ensure the operation, the maintenance, the renewal, and the management of that asset. And I think we heard Mayor Wagner speak to that very much in his opening remarks around how that is such a drain and a pressure on local governments who must maintain their infrastructure, but where that financing is not necessarily part of the planning when investments are planned out. So, of course, these recommendations are deliberately interconnected. Fiscal space without functioning local systems won't translate into investment. Strong local systems without viable financial pathways will still leave projects unfunded. Climate finance that doesn't reach local delivery won't deliver for national priorities. And infrastructure really can't be considered sustainable if the financing stops just in the construction phase. So we can go to the next slide. And really to talk about how are we translating this into practical action and what are our next steps. So all of these materials are, of course, available on CLGF's CSCN finance webpage, the full paper, a short brief about the recommendations, also a note on how to use these recommendations towards different actors and what our specific messages should be towards those actors to really mobilize for change. There's also case studies and examples from members and other related resources, and we're going to continue feeding information and knowledge into that portal. You've already heard from Richard Okuku, who's both a member of our Urban Finance Action Group, but who's also implementing some project work jointly with CLGF around financing for local government. We will have a series of these webinars, which will allow us now to dig more deeply into specific focal areas and hear about different country level projects and programs that are underway across our membership. Of course, we'll be working hand in glove with CLGF's Finance Task Force, which has kind of like that political mandate from CLGF to work on these issues, but to work towards influencing policy change in the Commonwealth. We'll be continuing these discussions in the progress towards this upcoming Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, and of course, towards CLGF's next Cross-Commonwealth Conference, which is taking place in March of 2027. So we very much invite you to draw on these materials, but we also invite you to tell us what will be the most useful way to use these materials and to help guide the work of both our action group and our task force as we go forward. So we're really hoping that today's webinar is the beginning of a conversation that we'll be having over the course of the next year. Lucy, back to you.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you, colleagues, for the continued kind of points that everyone's making in the chat. We have massively overrun our time. That is my fault entirely. I apologize, but it's because I think we had a fantastic group of speakers on this call. As ever, we probably tried to do a little bit too much in the first webinar, but I think it's been a great opportunity to hear from different voices and to understand a little bit some of the different perspectives that that we have in terms of these what are very, very complex issues. And I think issues that are really very much at the heart of CLGF and what CLGF tries to do in terms of bringing local government, central government, and other actors and partners together. And in many ways, that's really the power of the Commonwealth as a network. And that is something that we're really very, very keen to try to look at how we can leverage for local governments, for cities, and particularly on this question of urban finance. So we are also looking towards the upcoming Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, which is happening in the Caribbean later this year. Mayor Wagner will be attending the meeting to sort of be the voice of local government on our behalf. And we definitely want to make sure that these issues and recommendations that Claire's just shared are shared in that forum as well. Because that is really, I think, where we can help to sort of really sort of bring the voice of local government to some of those key decision makers, and I guess particularly heads and ministers of finance. So it really, I was going to do a little bit of a summing up. I'm not going to do that. As Clara said, this is the first in a number of webinars. We definitely still want to hear from you. If you have a really good case study that you think we should be incorporating into this bank of case studies, an innovation that you're taking forward, we would love to hear from you. But really, it's my job to say a huge thank you to Astrid for her presentation and for the paper, to David Jackson and for Richard Okuku for their work as part of the Urban Finance Action Group, but also today as you know, speakers and respondents, and for sharing your time and your expertise. To our chair, Mayor Wagner, for his continued support, but also I think for really demonstrating so brilliantly that kind of practice and policy in the work that's happening in Belize and the advocacy that he's doing more widely around the Commonwealth. And then finally, to my colleagues who have made this workshop possible. So Janine Xavier Cross, who manages our Commonwealth Sustainable Cities Network, to Claire Frost, our head of programs, other colleagues within CLGF, and most importantly to you as the participants who've been on this call from the beginning, for your interest, for your continued commitment, and collectively I look forward to working with you as we really continue to sort of drive and improve local government going forward. So thank you, everyone, and look out for the next webinar announcement. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.